Welcome to our first ever LinkedIn live stream at Treasury Payments. My name is Deepesh Patel, editor-in-chief and managing director at TTP, the truly independent media platform covering insights and thought leadership in the world of risk and liquidity management. Today, we have a stellar lineup of industry experts covering the triple T, that's tariffs, trade, and treasury. It's been a rollercoaster ride for us all recently, and in this broadcast, policy meets payments and tariffs meet treasury. As you all know, US tariffs are back in the headlines, but this time the impacts aren't abstract. According to the Financial Times, US tariffs are now seeing clear signs of price inflation driven by high import taxes, with consumer prices on the rise just as trade-related uncertainty deepens. Now, no one is immune. Canada and Mexico are seeing similar effects despite being inside some of those trade agreements. All of this raises quite big questions for corporates, corporate treasurers, and lenders. Are tariffs now a permanent feature of US economic policy? How should corporates respond when guidance changes so regularly? And are we entering a world where trade finance, sourcing strategy, and treasury decisions have to be recalibrated with every election cycle? That's what we're here to impact and unpack. I'm so happy to be joined by three experts from Washington, D.C., London, and Geneva: Leah Scarpelli, George Riddell, and Dmitry Grozoubinski. So without further ado, can I invite you all to this virtual stage, Leah, George, and Dmitry, and I'm going to ask you all to give a quick introduction. Who are you? Where are you from, and what do you do? What's your elevator pitch? Leah, let's start with you.
Sure. I'm Leah Scarpelli. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I'm a partner with ArentFox Schiff, which is a law firm here on K Street, and I work on international trade issues, specifically customs and tariff issues. So as you can imagine, we've been quite busy the past few months.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for joining from lovely DC. George, over to you.
Thanks, Deepesh. It's a pleasure. And hi to everyone here this afternoon or morning, depending where you are in the world. My name is George Riddell. I'm the managing director of Goyder Limited. We're a boutique trade consultancy helping companies and corporates reformulate their trade strategies, given all the volatility in the world at the moment.
Thank you. And Dmitry, over to you. And I have actually, shameless plug, I guess good for you, but I have got your book here.
Well, maybe one day you'll even read it. Hi, Deepesh. It's a pleasure to join you. My name is Dmitry Grozoubinski. I guess most relevantly to this call, I'm a trade consultant that provides geostrategic and economic advice as part of Aurora macro strategies. Beyond that, I train corporates and governments on trade policy and negotiations, and I'm really thrilled to be here.
Thank you very much. And to our audience watching, please do feel free to ask us questions, comment on LinkedIn, send us an email, drop us a comment, and we'll ask our panelists to join in on this live stream. Well, I guess, Leah, we'll start with you from DC, because you've been helping US importers navigate this evolving tariff regime. What are the current lobbying efforts that you're seeing in practice? Is it all shop talk? Are we seeing lots of silence?
So we're definitely seeing lots of efforts. I can't necessarily say that they've been particularly fruitful yet, but companies are absolutely lobbying their congressional representatives and administration officials, trying to inform them of the real-time impacts of these tariffs, and particularly the unpredictability of the rollout of these tariffs that we've seen over the past few months. Unfortunately, the congressional lobbying has not yet been particularly effective. That's a combination of factors. First of all, we have a Republican-controlled House and Senate in the United States. So the Democrats are all ears. They're happy to take the meetings. They're extremely supportive. But unfortunately, in this context, there's not a whole lot that they can do, and they know it. So not particularly helpful there. On the Republican side, privately, there is some support. There's definitely appreciation for the hardship that this is causing all sorts of businesses across their districts. But there's hesitance to speak out publicly against the administration at this point. It's important to remember we're still in early days here, even though it's felt like a lifetime for some of us. So at this point, there's a lot of hesitancy to reach out. So those meetings are ongoing, not yet bearing much fruit. On the administration side, the meetings are also happening, but at this point, it's hard to say who exactly is in control outside of the White House. So in the United States, we have a variety of trade agencies. This power is kind of split between the U.S. Trade Representative, the Department of Commerce, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and it's not yet shaken out really who is going to be taking the torch when it comes to implementing these tariffs and any exclusion processes that we're going to see in the future. So a kind of wait and see approach on the administration side.
Thank you very much. I guess, Dmitry, now one for you. Would you say we're at the eye of the tariff storm? Would you describe the situation as a kind of strategic pause for tariff wars? What's happening on the ground from your side?
So there's certainly a way you could look at it using that analogy, though I would say that if we're in the eye of the storm, the water is firmly somewhere around chest height. Certainly nothing is tranquil. There has been a phenomenon of, I think, commentariat and market reaction to the ebbs and flows of all this, where when there is something like a pause, whether it's on the Canadian and Mexican tariffs or more on the Liberation Day tariffs or on the Chinese tariffs, the point of reference is where the tariffs were a week ago and not where they were a year ago. So there is this sort of brief moment of euphoria where we drop from 145% tariffs on China to 30%. But if we had gone back a year, 30% would have been an unthinkable escalation. And certainly a US average tariff of 10% plus is significantly greater as a disruption of trade than anything we saw a year and a half ago, before you factor in the additional tariffs. So we are in a moment of brief pause as we wait to see what are the outcomes of the various negotiations the Trump administration is undertaking with those it paused tariffs on after Liberation Day and after the Chinese détente. But that is only a pause compared to where we were once they escalated. And I think what's becoming increasingly clear from a risk perspective is that this is simply not an administration that believes that a huge amount of transparency or a huge amount of transition time or a huge amount of warning is an important consideration, that stability and predictability are more important than some of their other priorities. And so I think we can expect buffeting winds for some time to come. It is fair to say that for many, the strategy seems to be, let's hope the Trump administration never discovers my pet issue, because that could thrust it into the headlines. And that shouldn't be helping anyone sleep well at night.
Thank you, and we'll go on to talking about. So, we'll unpick some of those, particularly audits of companies and things like that later on. Leah, what's your view from Washington DC? Would you agree with what Dmitry's just said?
Yes and no. Definitely, we seem to have had the big announcements of the past few months out of the way, and now we have some pauses where we can catch our breath and kind of figure out what's next. That being said, what we've seen with this administration is the big, splashy, brash announcement that's very short on details, and then the details kind of come later. So for some of these Liberation Day and other announcements, we've kind of seen Customs slowly start to fill in the practicalities of how these tariffs are implemented and what importers have to do to enter things correctly. So I think I was calling it the practical phase of these tariffs, where we have the announcement, the tariffs are out there. We had the vague executive order or the Truth Social post or however they were announced. And now we have the nuts and bolts of how do we actually deal with these tariffs and enter things correctly, especially when, in the case of China, for example, there's 4 different mechanisms through which the tariffs are being implemented.
Thank you very much. And I guess, George, what are your thoughts? Are many firms still implementing that last wave of tariff guidance? And just for our listeners, and kind of in layman's terms, why is there a delay between policy change and financial response? Or rather, how does that actually translate into financial response?
Sure, thanks. And very much agree with what's been said so far in terms of the companies that I've been working with. I think in terms of how do you react to all of these different announcements and their practical implications, at first there's definitely an informational overload. So how do you translate what is, quite chaotic at times, announcements into, and this is what it means for our customs operation. This is what it means for our CFO. This is what it means for our tax director. So that information transmission is becoming increasingly important around all of these developments. The second are, what are your very initial customs mitigations that you can take? I knew a number of companies that didn't even have the necessary duty deferment accounts with US Customs to enable them not to pay for every single consignment going in, but rather be able to make regular payments on their tariff bills. So there's a lot of the basics that have needed to be set up as companies are starting to adjust to the new normal where these tariffs are in place. And I think over the longer term, there's also a discussion ongoing around what does our sourcing strategy look like, particularly in a world where origin, where products actually come from, is so important for the potential different tariffs that are going to be coming from July onwards or later this year. So lots of considerations, but I think one final point is to emphasize the cross-functional impact that this is having on businesses. It's not just the customs team, it's not just the procurement team. It's something that really is expanding out through the whole business.
George, just to expand on that, would you say that corporates within the customs team or the certificates of origins team, etc., as well as the corporate treasury and financing teams, are they having to come together to make decisions and navigate this chaos as you described it?
So I think in the first instance, there's definitely a cash flow question that needs to be addressed, both from the perspective of the potential duty, the tariff bill that will come a company's way once they start being impacted by the measures. There's also potentially a logistics surcharge as well. We have seen shipping prices start to creep up in terms of how much it costs to ship a container from China to the US or other parts of the world. So not just the duties themselves, there are then the related costs. And then sort of looking forward, if you do start changing your supply routes, you do start changing suppliers, where you're sourcing products from, that obviously requires quite an extensive conversation between the treasury function and everyone else in the business, because there are costs associated with doing that.
Thank you very much. Dmitry, over to you. How would you say the US administration really is kind of refining its tariffs? We saw some things happening in 2018 to 2020, but what we're seeing now, would you say this is just blunt force or increasingly tactical? And what do you think we can expect? I'm asking you to get your kind of wish ball out in the medium to long term.
Sure. So I think at the start of this administration, it was certainly a blunt force, not response. I suppose it was a blunt force strategy, whereas previous U.S. administrations had certainly attempted to weaponize parts of access to the U.S. market for specific supply chains or to address specific industry concerns. This is the first time in, I suppose, decades where a US administration has said, first of all, fundamentally, the entire shape of global trade flows is problematic. And secondly, there is no problem at which we cannot throw tariffs as a weapon or as an attempt to generate negotiating currency and an attempt to shape the flows of supply chains and business decisions. I do think that we are perhaps beginning to see a little bit of refinement on the part of the US administration. It is, I always say, the US is so economically powerful that it is difficult to overestimate its ability to shape outcomes using its economy. But it feels like that might have been what the Trump administration may have done on Liberation Day. It did not provide enough warning. It did not do enough strategic planning. It did not do enough targeting. And it set its scope far too wide. I think the retreats we've seen, the pauses we've seen, I think are an acknowledgement that that was an overreach. But now looking especially at, for example, what is being rolled out around around too much Brexit content for me, around freight and shipping, we can see a more targeted approach, a more phased in approach, more warning for business. Still not nearly enough to reshape businesses on the scale of global shipping, but at least some acknowledgement that you cannot drop gigantic market shaping measures on everyone overnight immediately, and you need to do some planning before you pick a fight with every economy on earth while simultaneously picking a far larger fight with China. No one is quite certain to what extent that more tactical approach will hold. And I think this is still an administration whose decision-making process and long-term strategy remains opaque, to put that in most generous terms. So I think there is an element of perhaps they're being tactical this week. Will they be tactical next week? But that is a slight shift we're seeing, I think.
Leah, would you agree? Are you seeing the same thing from Washington, DC, perhaps from Congress, from lobbyists, or even from the courts?
Yeah, I think right now it's kind of a waiting game to see what the checks on this administration's power will really be. So historically, of course, the US system is all about checks and balances, with the traditional checks being Congress and the judicial branch on the executive. The courts, the judicial branch, have not been an effective check on tariffs just because of the timing. We're still seeing challenges to the first Trump administration tariffs, particularly on imports from China, the Section 301 tariffs. Those are still making their way through the courts. So when we're talking about, a 4, 5, 6 year lag between a challenge and any declaration that a tariff is unlawful, practically it's not helpful to go through the courts to challenge these tariffs, though many are certainly doing so, and we'll see how that shakes out. But in real time, Congress is the more effective check on the executive branch historically. The tariff authority, the president's ability to implement tariffs, is delegated by Congress through a series of different statutes and laws. Those laws have not been used the way that we're seeing them used by the Trump administration, particularly the International Emergency Economics Powers Act, IEPA, which has been used to implement these reciprocal tariffs, the 10% that we're seeing that was announced on Liberation Day. That requires the president to declare a state of emergency, which he's done, and Congress can end that emergency, which they have not shown any inclination to do, but the power is there. And the same for Section 232, the steel and aluminum tariffs, Section 301, the China tariffs, all of these different laws that are being used to implement the tariffs. Congress has a say in how those are implemented, and they have to approve a report or some sort of prerequisite to implement the tariffs, whether it be a declaration of a state of emergency, an investigation by a trade agency. So the checks are there, they're built in. The question is whether Congress is going to exercise them. And I think right now, the desire to do so is not there in the Republican Party, but as time goes on and we start to see the impacts of these tariffs on constituents and on businesses in their districts, and we get closer to the midterms and see how those shake out, we might see a change there. But I think in the short term, the external checks, the non-traditional checks, the business community, our allies globally, kind of the reaction of the markets, those have really been what is serving as a check on this administration in terms of the pauses that we've seen. Those, I think, are a direct reaction to the impact on the markets and the impact on the business community.
Thank you very much. And I mean, it's super interesting that the checks are there. Congress has the power to act, and perhaps right now Congress isn't acting. George, what would you say the mood is as a result of that amongst corporate treasurers, treasury functions, finance functions, and also the US banks themselves, perhaps some of those that are lending or providing various financial services, treasury, trade finance provision to those banks? Would you say they're treating this as a bit of a short-term noise, or are they already retooling some of their strategies?
So if we start with the trade finance question, I think the market reaction's been really interesting so far in some of the banks that I've been speaking to. There's definitely been the direct impact. So that's the, is the trade flow still happening? Yes or no? Is it still profitable with these extra charges coming on? If not, how are those extra, tariffs being passed on either to the customer or the end user of the product? So there is a degree of retooling, as some trades will no longer be happening, others will, but on slightly different terms. So how does that impact the financing? I think looking ahead, as we experience more of these supply chain shifts, that is going to become a knock-on impact for the trade finance industry, because there will be changes inevitably to the financing needed for those changed supply routes. So how does that impact on their operations? And also, just more broadly, if we do enter, considerable trade declines as a result, there is going to then be an impact on the need for trade financing. So number of different implications. I think we're starting to see the initial impacts on the industry, but definitely there's more to come as all of this flows through the system.
Thank you very much. I mean, super interesting. And on that kind of practical phase, Leah, you mentioned we are in this kind of practical phase of implementation. And would you say that companies are getting confused, in terms of customs guidance, perhaps conflicting instructions and kind of general compliance? What's the vibe you're getting from DC?
Yeah, I think chaos is the right word for it. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of changes to the guidance that we're getting, a lot of details that are coming out with a pretty substantial lag from the initial announcement. I do think that companies are working really closely with their brokers and their attorneys to get things right, partly because they understand the implications of getting them wrong with an administration that is shown to be so aggressive on trade and evasion issues. We're already hearing stories of U.S. Customs, staffing up the one federal agency that is not allowing layoffs or buyouts. They're really being aggressive with audits and going after companies that are doing it incorrectly. But even companies that are trying in good faith to import goods correctly are getting tripped up just because of the number of tariffs and the complex instructions for how to enter things when they're subject to multiple tariff regimes. So I think the most confusing issue is really how these tariffs stack on top of each other and which tariffs are take precedence over others in terms of the applicability. And when a tariff applies, do you have to pay the tariff to be subject to it? That's something that is causing a lot of confusion because there are some exclusions floating around out there. So there are a lot of gray areas still in the guidance. And I think what we're telling clients and I think is a good rule of thumb is this is no longer, an issue that can be outsourced to a single person in the company. When the tariff rates are this high and the implications are so stark of getting it wrong with the investigations and the audits, there's really a spotlight on trade compliance and tariff issues. So it has to be a C-suite level issue. There has to be buy-in in the company, and people have to understand what's going on with tariffs and be able to react very quickly to changes in the guidance or the rates, or the the countries that are subject to the tariffs. Anything and everything can change really on the same day, as we've seen.
Thanks, Leah. Dmitry, I guess, would you say that these tariff announcements are actually leading to supply chain reconfigurations, then perhaps lulls, then panics? And can you also talk about this kind of lag time we're seeing between a policy announcement and a kind of market response?
Sure, and I think we need to define our terms carefully here. When people talk about supply chain reconfigurations, what they are talking about is long-term shifts of where things are made or where components are procured from in a lasting way. And one of the side effects of the I suppose the pace of change and the unpredictability of change is, I think, most businesses have avoided making those kind of long-term decisions. Nobody is making a 10-year play on a $100 million capital investment based on a tariff that was here at the start of this sentence and may not be by the end of it. So I don't think we are seeing too much of that. There are announcements inevitably when you have this kind of highly politicized conversation happening. What you get is basically announcements that were in train for years already, or in many cases have already been announced, will be presented as a direct result of recent policy. But most of the stories you will get now about, somebody opens 11 new factories, somebody invests, is going to invest billions in this and this factory in the US or somewhere else. Those decisions were not made in the last 2 months. These have been conversations that have been going on for some time. So I think that's kind of important to flag. What you do have is effectively companies scrambling to, in the short term, either source what they need in order to get around tariffs, try to get their products in ahead of tariffs on the assumption that the tariffs will not last a long time in their full capacity, canceling orders that are about to be hit with tariffs but haven't made it onto a vessel yet, or looking for short-term and, in some cases, I would say dubious fixes, like attempting to redirect the flow of their goods through third parties in an effort to avoid direct connections that face tariffs.
Yeah.
In a strategy that I don't think has a lot of long-term flow, because of course Customs and Border Protection is very aware of this kind of loophole, and rules of origins and such things exist specifically to prevent it. So I think you're seeing a lot of those kind of quick reactions. What you're not seeing a lot of, I think, yet, and Leah and George may correct me on this, is long-term shifts in where things are made, because companies are just not yet ready. I will say one final thing is that there is a rather, I don't know if it's strange or a phenomenon whereby political announcements often have a significant lag between when something is announced and on the front pages and when effectively the enabling regulations is published in the relevant, say, customs journals, or is enacted. And so just for example, the tariffs on UK vehicles that were announced to great fanfare are still in place, because we're still waiting, I believe, for the enabling kind of details to be worked out and published. So there is also a lag between announcement and reality, in addition to a lag between announcement and corporate response.
Which is super interesting, because I think we said earlier, perhaps even though there's a bit of a pause on all these shock announcements, Leah, we're now seeing the details coming through, and actually a lot of your clients are having to act on those, right? How would you say they are responding now that a lot of these details are actually coming through?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely trying to diversify their sourcing, have more flexible supply chain and shipping situations in terms of delaying shipments if they have to, because we are seeing a situation, as Dmitry mentioned, where the rate might be, 10% on a Monday, 20% on a Tuesday, back to 10 on a Wednesday. So when your ship enters U.S. customs territory, it becomes really important, and you have to have a way to delay that entry if it's going to have a major impact in terms of your duty liability. So, bonded warehouses, FTZs, all of those questions are becoming really important for our clients. In terms of the long-term strategies, I absolutely agree. I mean, there's a lot of hesitancy to make long-term investments right now because we don't know where to go other than not China. So it's hard to say who the next target will be, who the next ally will be. We've seen some shakeups in terms of traditionally who we think to be, really safe trading partners like Canada, not so safe anymore necessarily. And we'll see how that plays out with the USMCA renegotiations. But it's hard to make long-term decisions when you don't have that certainty in terms of what the rates will be and who our preferred partners will be in the next year, not to mention in 4 years when we have a change of administration.
Thanks, Leah. George, I guess the big question with that tariff unpredictability, how are the corporates actually managing their liquidity? Because if you double the tariff, that's a potentially a lot less liquid cash that they no longer have access to. Are we seeing perhaps higher capital buffers? Are we seeing an increase in the need for more financing? Or are we simply seeing, a slowdown and that strategic shift towards supply chain rerouting, or are we too early on to actually see data or see corporates making those big, bold decisions?
So I don't think it's there yet in the data. If anyone watching does have that data, I would be absolutely fascinated to see it. So please do share it. But I think it will come in the coming months. I think in terms of the first response, absolutely, as Leah said, things like bonded warehouses, free trade zones, that helps you preserve that liquidity by not having to pay the duties immediately are definitely a tool that businesses are increasingly look at to save and maintain cash flow. I would also say that, companies are taking quite a hard look at their customs and trade operations overall. Certainly, when you start looking under the hood of a lot of businesses, there are inefficiencies that have built up over, previous years, decades of trading, origin management, looking at, customs valuation. There are normally fairly significant savings and efficiencies that can be made as part of the broader supply chain reorganization. So while this is definitely a threat, I would also, always be keen to highlight those opportunities as well to really transform the trading operations of businesses and corporates as they're undergoing what is understandably a volatile period. And then obviously, sort of as we've been talking about, those big investment decisions, certainly the trade risk to any future business strategy definitely needs to take a lot higher priority than it would have done even 6 months ago, with sort of the election and the inauguration of this new US administration. So trade risk needs to be high on the corporate strategy agenda at the moment, and that will inevitably impact investment decisions and broader Treasury considerations going forward.
Thanks, George. So yeah, trade risk high on the agenda. Leah, George mentioned bonded warehouses, free trade zones, and new sourcing hubs. Leah, would you say that kind of with regards to what George just mentioned, how does this change how you advise your clients?
I think it's consistent with what George is saying. I mean, I just need to have high level engagement across the company in terms of compliance. It can't be a single person or even a single department. It has to be, across disciplinary, sales, corporate, buy-in across the company in terms of how to navigate this, because the stakes are just too high in terms of impacts on companies with the rates that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah. I mean, of course. Dmitry, this kind of evolving tariff playbook that we're seeing, how do you think this could play out on a global scale, particularly with say EU, Japan, or others that are starting to use tariffs as political levers? Do you think that's going to continue? How do you think the market will kind of change over the coming months?
So there are very few global actors with anything like the commercial muscle or the consumer final demand to do anything on the scale of what the US has done over the last couple of months. For the and we can sort of rattle them off. The Chinese have attempted to use access to their market as a tool of foreign policy before. Most recently by applying tariffs on Australian exports like wine and wheat in an effort to shape a number of, effectively to play out some political grievances around sort of 2020. Now, I think at the moment they are trying to position themselves publicly as sort of the anti-US in many ways, and I think they're going to shy away from that kind of thing precisely because they're trying to tell a story about China as a country that plays by the global trading rules and is a safe hub for investment and will not do things like this. So I think there are going to be limits there, except bilaterally with the US. Though it should be said that if the US massively expands its trade war on China in other ways, such as applying secondary sanctions of the sort applied to Venezuelan purchases of Venezuelan oil potentially, then that could change. For the European Union, I think the one, I suppose, factor is that the Trump approach has not necessarily been messaged very well and has created its own political anti-gravity, in the sense that for many European politicians, the polls would suggest that being seen as too Trumpian carries with it considerable risks. I think the Australian and Canadian opposition parties have recently discovered what that feels like in rather short order. So they are not going to be able to do anything of the sort, nor are they super inclined to. But I do think they are going to continue to use access to the European market in an effort to either promulgate their environmental and other social standards, or at the very least, in some way rebalance the potential for regulatory arbitrage of manufacturing in places that have what the Europeans see as lax of regulation and then selling into the European market. Japan probably doesn't have the consumer final demand to do this sort of thing and has significant investment in the global trading system. So I don't think it's hugely likely that they will be tempted to do anything of this scale. With that said, the global trading system having its largest player so brazenly sort of opt out of its underlying principles certainly increases the temptation and decreases the taboo for others to do the same. And what may begin as, for example, retaliation against the US, not strictly within the spirit of the WTO rules or spirit, could very well evolve into other areas. One of the foundational sort of principles of the WTO and the other trading rules is, hey, protectionism is politically tempting. And that temptation hasn't gone away.
Thank you, and that's a really good point to kind of end on. And I'm going to ask one concluding question to you all, which is more of a practical take home to some of our listeners. And George, I will start with you. If you were to be advising a corporate treasurer, a bank or a policymaker, given all the disruption we are seeing at the moment, what's one thing that they should be really thinking about, watching, or doing right now, George?
So if we look at starting with the corporate part of your question, I think, and just to reiterate what's been said through the live stream today, no one person can do it alone within a business. It needs to be cross-functional. It needs to have senior buy-in. And unless it does, a lot of the planning becomes really challenging because it does just touch on so many different parts of the business. And, depending on the business, depending on their supply chains, the risk factor can, go from material to existential quite quickly. So getting that senior buy-in, getting it at cross-functional is incredibly important. I think also looking to use sort of the Nate Siller's phrase, signal from the noise. There are a lot of announcements often made quite late at night on social media, understanding that those are going to happen, but really following what the core announcements are, what the actual implementation looks like in order to go through the impacts to the business. So that's where I'd start. In terms of policymakers, in any trade department around the world, I know from speaking with ex-colleagues and contacts, it is chaotic at the moment. The best of luck to you, I think, and all the well wishes, because this is certainly going to continue for some time, and we're not out of even the beginning stages of it in all likelihood.
No, thank you. And Leah, I'm going to go over to you and feel free to just pick one here.
Sure. So I think just to echo what George was saying, the devil's really in the details here. There's a lot of noise, a lot of tweets and Truth Social posts. I think they're called truths. But in any event, when you see the news, the headline, it's important to look beyond it, look at the executive order, look at the customs instructions, get the details on what this actually looks like. Sometimes they're different. The rates on those billboards on Liberation Day were different than the rates in the executive order. So it's really important that you're looking at the actual formal announcement of these tariffs and getting it right. Yeah. And then just one more word. We don't have an exclusion process yet, but we are very hopeful that we will one day have one. So this is the moment where you can kind of be laying the groundwork there, think about some of the arguments that might help you to ultimately get an exclusion, start the dialogue. If you have congressional representatives, now is the time to reach out in advance of that process, because it will be really important.
I mean, just to follow on from that, would you say there is still quite a lot of back channel lobbying that's happening?
Absolutely. Now is the time to start that conversation. We have a lot of clients inviting their representatives out for visits, so they can see the U.S. business that is supported by imports, kind of see how the supply chain fits together, and understand the impacts on real people that these tariffs have. And all of that's going to be important when we get to exclusions, hopefully in the next few months.
No, super interesting. And Dmitry, hopefully you're still with us, but over to you.
Yeah, I think I would mostly give a plug here for those like Leah and George. We've talked a lot about not having one person in your company who's in charge of this, and I would support that 100%. A secondary point to that is to ensure that you have a strong pipeline for that person or that team to be able to candidly tell you just how hard some of what is being contemplated is. Trade has always suffered from a perception that you can just get on with it, and how hard could it possibly be? Surely this is just a form. Look up the data and plug it into the form. And this isn't exclusively with the Trumpian tariffs. We're seeing a lot of this with the European carbon border adjustment that I know George is an expert on. It is entirely possible that a given firm does not have the data that borders need in order to process it. It is entirely possible that the paperwork is significantly more onerous than any normal human being could ever anticipate it being. So one of the things that it's really important to get onto now is to make sure that those in your company whose job it is to deal with these problems that are at the coalface have the ear of those and have the confidence without feeling like they're going to be accused of laziness or naysayerness to basically say, hey, what's coming down the pipe at us is too big for me. It's too hard. It has implications bigger than you might think. Let's sit down and have a process to manage it, because there's a lot of counterintuitive landmines to be stepped on here, and they're only going to get bigger. So, make sure that they have the space to go, I need someone to hire Leah to help me, or I need someone to hire George to help me think through this, because they may be drowning.
Yeah, and especially because once audits do come in, and there's probably conflicting advice coming from different firms, it is important to have someone that you can kind of reach out to independently for that piece of advice. So just to summarize, it really is a cross-functional piece within the business. You do need lots of teams to kind of come together and work collectively through addressing some of these tariff changes, communicate to policymakers, communicate to your kind of representative, and make sure that these are heard, and also focus on the detail. Don't necessarily be drowned by the noise of the truths and the tweets, but actually look at those orders, make sure that they are understood, because often the rhetoric that we see quite often on the news and on social media is actually different to the actual detailed result. So thank you, Dmitry, Leah, and George, for joining us on this broadcast, our first ever LinkedIn live stream on trade treasury payments. Such a pleasure to have you. And for those of you that want to re-listen to this session, it will be available on Spotify or on your favorite podcasting platform, on YouTube, available to replay, and we'll also be writing up an article on the piece. So thank you very much, Dmitry, Leah, and George, for joining.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.